The Joyful Friar podcast is made possible by the generous support of our friends. To support the podcast, please visit nathan-castle.com and donate today. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm Father Nathan Castle, your host, ably assisted today with a kind of sleepy assistant, Toto. He's had a full day. He has a little bit of epilepsy, and he was sleeping with me last night when he had an attack, so he didn't have a completely restful night. And he's been on an adventure with his owner, Father Richard. We're together on vacation, and he's been out having lots of fun today, so he's a little sleepy. The other person that you can see on this screen is Father Kevin Goodrich, who is a Dominican in the Anglican branch of the Dominican Order. We're only really getting to know each other a little bit. Sometimes I have guests on here who are old friends of mine, and I'd like to think of Kevin as a new friend, but we'll get to know him together a little bit better. Kevin and I met at a conference in Tucson back in April of 2024 called the Science of Consciousness Conference. It's a collaboration of the University of Arizona, where I live, and the University of Michigan. They hold this conference, I think, every year, don't they?
They do, yeah.
And then I think it's 1 year in Tucson and then 1 year somewhere else, then back in
Yeah,
Tucson.
they're going to be in Europe, I think, the next year. Yeah.
Okay. So it's right in my backyard, and a lot of the contributors to it are on the campus. I live right on the campus, and so this activity is happening all around me. This is the first time I attended it. And your Father Kevin Goodrich, you dress conspicuously, as I do.
Yes.
He was in his Dominican habit at this conference, where most of the people are not there from any religious point of view. It's, in fact, I don't know if you attended any of these, Kevin, but studying spirituality in neuroscience and therapy, cortical oscillations, waves, and consciousness,
Right.
quantifying cognitive states in neural data. I felt like I might be the stupidest person in the room for much of these talks. But
Yeah, really brilliant people, scientists, neuroscientists, physicists. And what's fun about that conference, the Science of Consciousness conference, it was my first time as well, is that it's very eclectic. So usually if you go to a scientific conference, there's just traditional scientists, high level, and they're just, they're very along the scientific method and the traditional scientific community's way of doing things. What's curious about this conference is that you have all those folks. So, university researchers, professors, but then they open it to spiritual practitioners, which are
yeah,
mostly almost not any Christians. But, so folks who have Eastern points of view, Hindus, New Agers, and then just like anybody else who like happens to be interested in this topic. So
yes,
that's what I found particularly fun about it, is just the variety of people who were there.
me too. That one and some others I attended. This one is much more academic than most of the other things that I do attend. But
That's true for you. Yeah.
it seems like across the board that Buddhism and Hinduism are the most represented. That and maybe secular meditation, transcendental meditation, or people that meditate without a
Yes.
particular spiritual root to it, or organized religion root. Often you find shamans from shamanistic traditions, but
Yes.
I know that you have an abiding interest in mystical experience within the Christian tradition, and I hope you're going to share some of that with us today.
Absolutely. But you're right. So knowing a little bit about you and then looking at your background, yeah, a lot of your conferences and people you be with are much more on like the experiential spirituality side, not necessarily Christian, certainly some Christian Catholic and other things, but this conference does have a heavy academic emphasis with, people with long publication lists and who teach at university. But again, like one session I went to, someone's like, I am a neuroscientist, but I'm also a shamanic practitioner. So it's an interesting combination.
Yeah. So before we get too far ahead of ourselves, tell us who you are anyway. How did you come to have all these degrees and be this Anglican priest and so on? Who are you, and how did you grow up and become the person you are?
So yeah, Father Kevin Goodrich. I'm originally from New England, so I'm a New Englander, sort of by temperament, by how I was raised. was very fortunate in that I grew up out in the country in a rural area. It's just beautiful. In fact, I was just there a couple weeks ago, and I was just reminded of how fortunate I was to basically grow up in the woods in this lovely area. And we hunted, we grew pretty much all of our own food. We had apple orchards, so I was blessed in that way. There were challenges like everybody else has challenges growing up. My father was an atheist, as far as I know, to the day that he died. He was not a hostile atheist that we sometimes think about today, people that are like out to take out Christianity or argue. He was just not persuaded, and it wasn't for him. And then my mother wasn't particularly religious or spiritual either, but she went to church for my sake and brought me. So really grew up in a secular home for all intents and purposes.
Mhm.
But because she did bring me, then I started to get interested, and I grew up in the Episcopal Church and the Anglican tradition, and faith and spirituality. However, I did not find the church to be a spiritual place. That was not my experience. Like good people, warm, supportive, doing some good things in the community. So I started to experiment and look for the divine elsewhere because I had this hunger as a child and then as I grew to experience the divine.
You had a dream that sent you in that direction, didn't you?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And some people thought when I was a kid that I think now people realize that's not true, but they thought I was like sort of a prodigy or something. I was very normal in every other way. In fact, I got in trouble a lot at school and, I had lots of friends, good times, all of that. But there was this spiritual draw. And I did have a dream very early in my life that sort of was always there that started to push me toward experiential forms of spirituality. And so I experimented with all sorts of things. But to sort of speed up the story a little bit, one day, I think it's by God's providence and grace, I came across the mystics, the Christian monastics and mystics. And as I started to read them, I was like, oh, there are people in the Christian tradition who know something about actually experiencing God. Like I had not found that. I had not discovered that. Even with my priests who were very good and influential in my life, I just didn't find it. But then when I started reading them, I said, I don't have to become Buddhist. I don't have to become Hindu. I don't have to become a New Ager. There's things I learned from those traditions and still value, but I can find it right within my own. And so
What
that's what
age are you at this part in the narrative?
probably teenage late teenage years is when I really run into the mystics properly.
Okay.
And then I started looking at religious orders and things started to develop from there. So yeah, a lot of experimentation, not unusually, but my experimentation was really spiritual in many ways.
Uh-huh. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, because I wasn't finding it in the church, I started doing a lot of reading. Uh, Shamanism, indigenous forms of spirituality, Buddhist meditation, the world's religions. I was reading their primary texts. I was trying stuff out on my own. I got involved in neo-paganism and so I experimented a lot with trying out the practices because I wanted to experience things.
Hmm.
And there were strange things, and then there were just silly things, and met other people who were experimenting with some of those things as well or trying them out. Um, and probably if someone in my Christian experience had been more experiential, I may not have done that, but
Right.
in hindsight, it's been helpful as a spiritual teacher because it allows me to relate, I think, to a wider range of people. So many people have tried out those things today or are still exploring them.
Hmm.
And so I know my experience many times that people come into me, they're like, well, I wasn't sure whether you were going to be judgmental or what you were going to say. They're like, well, then you were so understanding. And I said, well, part of it is because it's my story as well.
Right. Do you use the word Catholic to refer to yourself?
Yeah, I would say that in the Anglican tradition, we don't necessarily think of ourselves always as Roman Catholic, obviously, but we draw upon that common tradition of the Catholic aspects of Christianity, though we also draw upon Protestant aspects as well.
Well,
Certainly within the religious orders in the Anglican tradition, there's a strong Catholic tradition.
okay. Because I'm Roman Catholic, but I think of myself as Catholic, capital C and lowercase
Mm.
c. The
Yes.
irony is that in English language, the capitalized Catholic is a subset of the smaller lowercase
Mm,
and the word just means universal. And you're describing the universe. You're talking about I went here, there, and elsewhere looking for all kind of ways to experience the sacred, the divine.
yeah.
And um, I believe that when we're at our Catholic best, we're at home in the universe, wherever that takes
Mm.
us. Yeah.
Yeah, you have a fun on your webpage, a fun picture of you, and you kind of, elucidate that through the picture of you in your habit, the picture of you in plain clothes and
Yeah.
Catholic, and yeah, the truly universal sense of the human spirit and the divine spirit. So I had a lot of encouragement. In fact, many people identified before I did, well, even when I was a child, this a sense of priesthood. Like they saw that in me in a very early age. It wasn't really until I was a teenager that I started thinking about that, even as I was experimenting with lots of other things. Um, and I did finally have a priest who came to the church, and she was much more encouraging. She took me to a seminary where they were giving interfaith discussions and Buddhist discussions, and also just encouraging me in my sort of curiosity about things spiritual. So she was helpful and influential in that way. But it was really through the Christian mystics that I made a mature commitment to Christianity. And
Hmm.
that's when I started to go deeper within the mystical tradition. One of the first people that I ran into was Julian of Norwich. She's so famous now, she's sort of gone viral, but she was one of the first Christian mystics that I read and had a sense of connection with and a sense of affirmation that, oh, this is a part of a pursuit of a Christian spirituality, of the Trinity, and a lot of the traditional things, because she uses a lot of the traditional language, and that's her experience from the Middle Ages. And yet she also has all these innovative ideas. It's an integration. So Julian was very important.
What makes her so captivating? What did she experience and pass along that caught your imagination?
2023 last year was the 650th anniversary of Julian of Norwich's revelations, showings, uh, the revelations of divine love. Julian was a medieval woman who lived in the 1300s, the 14th century in England, and Norwich, sort of eastern coast of England. And most of what we know is from her book, which is generally recognized as the first book written by a woman in English. And her book is written based on this experience she had. She was dying, thought she was dying. She was on her deathbed. And her priest comes to deliver last rites. And he holds in front of her a crucifix. And then from that point, she has a series of 16 visions, or she calls them showings in her Middle English, the version of English spoken at that time. And there are various things. And then she has a full recovery. So they all thought she was going to die. She fully recovers. She writes down a shorter version of these revelations, what is now called the short text. And then later, after 20 years of contemplation and reflection and a lot of wrestling with God, she writes down what's the longer text, which is generally what people are talking about when they said they've read Julian or they're quoting Julian, is usually from the longer text. A few interesting things about the showings are one, she uses mothering language for God. She says,
Mhm.
just as God is our father, God is our mother. Now, some earlier medieval theologians like St. Anselm and others had sort of used that language, but she develops it in this amazing way that really no one before her has. And then there's several implications of this mothering language for how God holds us even when we fall, and how God understands us when we sin or when we make a mistake. She rereads the atonement, she rereads salvation, the final judgment, the sort of mothering, very gracious care um, from her understanding of these revelations. So that's provoked a lot of people in her message of hope in a very dark time with the plague, with violence outside her door. So that has inspired a lot of people. And then that's juxtaposed with the fact that she was an anchoress. So for people who don't know what an anchoress is, it was a form of spiritual commitment in the 14th century that was uncommon but well known and affirmed, and there were people doing it. And as an anchoress, you actually just lived in one place, and you actually, for the most part, lived in one room. You actually were sealed into it. The funeral service was prayed for you. You died to the world, and you committed the rest of your life to a life of prayer and an interior journey while living in this cell. And you can still visit her cell at St. Julian's Church in Norwich.
These were very often attached to a church building, weren't they?
Yeah, and so hers is attached to the church. It was attached, and it still is. There's a reconstruction. The church, obviously, over the ages, has had various iterations. But so the combination of her solitude and enclosure, and the hopefulness of her visions, all kinds of people of many spiritual paths are inspired. And her most famous phrase is, "All shall be well."
Yes. And if people might have heard that and not know where it came from, but that's something that she's contributed. That's, I think, entered into the popular lexicon.
Yeah, absolutely. You hear it all the time. In fact, it's a hashtag.
When did St. Dominic and Dominican Order, Dominican spirituality come into your awareness?
So when I made a commitment to the Christian faith, it was through Christian mystics and monastics. So as I was reading Julian, that led me to two other writers, some more mystical, some more just in the classic, sort of desert father tradition or a rigorous Christian prayer life tradition. So that made me think about religious life, you know. So I started looking at different religious orders. When I came across the Dominicans, something immediately connected with me. One aspect was I started preaching as a teenager, which is very unusual in the Episcopal Church and by most mainline, denominations. And so what captivated me was the combination of active preaching ministry, teaching, the intellectual life of the order, but they also very much have a mystical, as you know, a mystical tradition. So a life of deep interior prayer, contemplation, and then you're sharing that with the world. So those aspects started to draw me. And then I got connected with Anglican Dominicans and entered the process, and then eventually went to seminary and so on.
I was thinking back on my introduction to Dominicans was in my family. Both of my dad's siblings were Dominicans.
Oh, well, yeah, two uncles. Well, that helps. Yeah, or
They were
aunt.
aunts, Dominican
Okay, yeah,
sisters.
okay.
But they were, my dad's was very close to the elder of the two. In fact, she was 6 years older than he, and she had a large role in raising him,
Okay.
as kind of a combination of a sister and mother. And
Mm,
when she went to a Catholic high school where Dominicans were most of the faculty, and she entered right at 18. As soon as she graduated
wow.
high school, she went right into the convent. And he felt like he was all alone in the world. He was heartbroken
Mm,
when she
hmm.
did that. And then the sibling that was closer to him in age, 3 years different, when she graduated high school, she did the same thing. So he was, I think, in his senior year of high school, both of his siblings were already Dominicans. And I grew up around the order, but I'd never met Dominican men. So when I
Mm,
began to have the same kind of stirrings, that I knew that I wanted I thought God was the most important thing I could think of. And
mm.
why wouldn't I want to spend my life on what was most important? And
Yes.
and then I was growing up during Vatican II in the 60s, and the church was changing so fast and not always that effective, and is trying to figure out what its message was. It
Right.
was changing the way that it did so many things, that some of the older formulations worked and others didn't. So anyway, I was growing up in a period of a lot of change, and I just thought I'd like to be in the middle of this and help my peers um, appropriate the faith, know the Lord, and
Yeah.
know the
Yeah.
Holy Spirit, and all that. I'm conscious that I've got this sleepy dog in my lap. Uh, do you know that story of Dominic's mother having a dream about?
Yes, the dream. That's right. Yeah, the hounds. Yeah, torch. Right, going out into the world. Yeah.
She, when she was pregnant with Saint Dominic, she had this dream that she was giving birth to a dog with a torch in its mouth, and it would light the world on fire. So
Hmm.
in our lore, Saint Dominic is often depicted with a dog, usually a kind of larger dog at his feet with a torch in its mouth. And we were in Latin, Dominicanus is a pun. It sounds like God's dogs, Domini, Cani, Cani. And so we were called God's dogs. And I believe the one that is falling asleep in my lap I call him the canine face of God. Oh, did I wake you? Uh,
Well, he
he's
was mentioned, so he thought he would. perk up a little bit.
He
Yes.
and he often, without his name being called, knows he's being talked about.
Well, he does. He's paying attention right there. Yeah, one
Yeah,
dog to another. So yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So you meet the beginning of the mystical tradition. You move into to the Dominican world. How does that continue to grow or change in your life?
Well, what's interesting is, and I think this is true of many, it's been my experience, it's been true of others, that often what drew people to ministry or priesthood or the pastorate or whatever form of religious service is kind of two things. So for a lot of people, it's they want to help people, through the form of faith. Okay. But then a lot of us were drawn through the interest in spirituality or mysticism or something like that. And then as the years passed, we realized, oh, we are not really doing that. We are running institutions, and getting
Yes,
occupied with doing a lot of other things than, our first love, to, paraphrase the book of Revelation. So that always has remained a thread for me throughout all my form of service. But there's certainly been seasons where I got away from it and I got back to it. But the Dominicans, yeah, I've read Thomas and Meister Eckhart and, some of the usual suspects. Particularly love Catherine because she is a mystic herself.
yes,
And like many of the mystics, she's bizarre. Like, she's very enthralling and interesting at the same time. She's sort of strange and repelling,
yes,
like many of the mystics are. So,
yeah. Do you know Rose of Lima?
yes, exactly. Another, like these people who don't, these women who don't eat anything. And, so yeah.
Yes, she came through. I have her words in I think my second, or maybe my first book. When I was helping a soul and using a prophetic gift to allow a speech through, she came through and she kind of took my part. She said something like, uh, I was a person who had odd gifts that people thought of as quite peculiar and strange, but they're just part of the way God does things. So kind of get
Mm,
over it, just get over it.
yeah,
Anyway, she's delightful.
she is. And I think that's a great way of, because on one hand, people think of mysticism as like, ooh, like, this weird, crazy stuff that strange people are interested in. It's like, well, okay, yeah, there's some truth to that. And yet it's also just part of the normal parts of God's grace. And not all mysticism is showy and fireworks. I think often the sense of the grace of God in someone's life is much more subtle, and more people experience it than they know. They just don't have the words for it, or they associate mysticism only with extraordinary phenomena. But
Yes.
yeah, it's part and parcel of life. So
I remember having an experience of St. Dominic probably about 25 years ago or something, and he spoke to me. And I was asking him about because mystical stuff was happening in my life more and more, and I thought, "You're my
mm,
spiritual father. Help me out
mm,
here. What do I do with all this?" And I said, "Like you, we have these stories of you and Mary, Mother of Jesus, talking back and forth, and that our Dominican habit is given
yeah,
uh, from Mother Mary to Saint Dominic." And I said, "What did you make of this? I mean, you were going about your day." Maybe you were just saying, rather mundane prayers, and then you end up talking to Mary the Mother. When he spoke to me, he spoke in a kind of Spanglish, the kind of English that would have existed in the early 1200s would have been
hmm
basic or something like that.
mm,
Uh, but he spoke in a kind of Spanglish. He said, "Ah, yes, I see what you are thinking." How did he say it? You're wondering, I'm having marvelous mystery experience. And then it end.
mm,
And then he
mm.
said, and then I say to myself, and now I must launder my clothing and write letters.
Exactly. And that kind of many of the mystics talk about that. One minute they're talking about very mundane matters, or St. Teresa talking about the monasteries or the convent and the reform movement, and then this happens. So another excellent point, that often the mystics, we think of them as just levitating or in these extraordinary states all the
Yes.
time. but actually they were living their lives. They were carrying out the responsibilities of their lives, the mundane, the difficult, the painful, the joyful. And these things
Yes.
are sort of woven, these experiences were woven throughout them.
Yes. And then I'm thinking of how we discovered not too many years ago that Mother Teresa had a dark night of the soul,
Yes,
doing
yes.
all this hard work, enormously hard work, and felt like wondering if there really is a God.
Right. Yeah. No,
Um,
I think that's extraordinary because she kept at it. I don't know that I would, I mean, especially the type of service and ministry she was doing.
the stuff that gets written down is the real, splashy stuff. And then a paragraph will say, and then 5 years later, this other thing happened.
That's
What,
right.
what was he or she doing in those 5 years? A lot of times they're saying prayers that feel like you're talking to the wall.
Yep.
It's not like in the among the mystics, every time they ever composed themselves to be in prayer, that they had all kind of pyrotechnics going on.
No, a lot of it was desert time, but a lot of it is just, what I think of as just the everyday mundane. There's little ups, there's little downs, there's a lot of tedious things. And a life of prayer is like that. You pray the liturgy of the hours, or you go to mass, or pray your own personal prayers. It's just, sometimes it's just, yeah, just like with relationships, friends, sometimes you hang out, it's okay, or marriage or whatever. Um, Life is like that, including the spiritual life.
Yeah. Well, your life right now, at least professionally, which title do you use at St. John's Episcopal Church in Dubuque? Are you pastor or rector, or are those interchangeable?
Yeah, those are interchangeable. So they're from Roman Catholic communities. So I often will just use pastor because people understand that better. But yeah, I'm the rector. That's a typical term in Episcopal circles. And then I teach some also for the University of Dubuque Theological Seminary. So
So how do you divide your time? Are you full-time employed in a local church?
yeah, my principal service is the parish, and then I the seminary, and then I still do itinerant work. So before I came to St. John's, I did a lot more. When I lived in Canada, I did itinerant work within the diocese there, and then I did missions, different parts of the Western world. And when I came here, it was sort of agreed upon I would do far less, but I would still do some. For example, I'm leaving in a few days to do some preaching in England and Wales and some mystical research. And last year I got a lot of places because it was the 650th anniversary of Julian's showing. So I went to many places,
Wow.
Australia and Ireland, spoke at academic conferences, gave retreats and reflections, New Zealand.
Uh-huh.
But that was a special year just because 650th anniversary and don't come up very often.
No, but you met a lot of people who probably want you back for something else. You're not a one-trick.
Yeah, those things lead one thing can lead to another, but it's always a balancing and the main thing presently is here at the parish, but yes, it's wonderful to be able to be on the road and as you know, that's very much a part of the Dominican tradition, the
Exactly.
itinerant work.
Yeah. St. Dominic hardly ever really had a cell of his own. He was usually a guest in
That's
whatever
right.
house he was in because he went from one to the next, checking on everybody and
Right.
encouraging. Yeah.
Yeah.
You wrote a book called Cell Phone Spirituality, What Your Cell Phone Can Teach You About Life and God. Can you give us a highlight or two? How did that idea even come to you, and what did you do with it?
So that was my first book. It's almost 20 years ago now.
So
And
a flip phone then.
yes, in fact, I happen to have the cover is it's a flip phone, so it looks like from another time. But well, like all of us trying to make analogies for the life of faith. And if you look at Jesus, he's always pointing at the ordinary life, the farmers and the agriculture and what people understood. And while it wasn't completely mainstream then, it was becoming so. So I thought, well, let's use this new technology, this new device that more and more people have as an analogy for the spiritual life. So hearing from God, the reception, all of that kind of thing. And so I use it as an analogy throughout the book to basically it's an introduction to Christian spirituality in a popular sense. There's exercises, there's group questions, and I was flattered that Richard Rohr endorsed the book. So I sent it to him, and then he actually got back to me when I was sort of floored, but he endorsed the book, so that was great.
He's a wonderful guy. I've met him a few times. He
Good.
endorsed my Toto book too.
Yeah, he's very generous, you
Yeah,
know, with that sort of thing. But still, it was great that he encouraged it. And yeah, and there's a lot of good metaphors for the spiritual life. And now we can even add the whole texting dimension. Texting wasn't as strong,
of
you know,
course.
back when I originally put the book together, but so much of it still applies. You have to listen, you have to be in the right place to get the right reception.
Right.
You can be distracted and so forth.
And you might have to put it down if you were to write that book now or do an update of it. I think so many people who work with late adolescents and college, as I did for so long, are concerned about the amount of time young people spend on their phones when there were no schools, and the schools weren't open.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we're always talking about that. There's so many people talking about that. And I do, in one of my updates of the book, one of the newer editions, I do have like a little line about that because now it's become uh, an obstacle for people of paying attention to what's important, whether it's God or the people in their life. Uh, you know, that question is going to become more and more and more with artificial intelligence
Yes.
and as technology becomes more and more invasive. And I've been doing work on that. We hosted a conference on artificial intelligence here recently, just a few weeks ago, and that was good. And we're doing some speaking, some popular things about that as well. Yeah.
Mhm. Good. We're getting near the end of our time together. Is there something that I haven't asked you or that you haven't said that you would like for us to hear?
Just that there's more to the Christian life and more to a life of faith or spirituality, however you happen to conceive that, listener or viewer. There's more, and it's not all fireworks, but there is more that can be had that can sustain you when life is great and when life is not so great. Your faith can be a consolation. Your spiritual life can be very practical as well as very esoteric. So keep looking, keep searching, and within back storerooms of the Christian faith that we often don't go into, there are all these wonderful treasures, and I encourage you to check them out.
Are people able to contact you through your website, or is there a way that they can be in touch with
Yeah,
you?
absolutely. So you could go to fathergoodrich.com and there's a place to contact me there. I have a newsletter. I send out little reflections on the spiritual life monthly or so. So those would be some ways that people wanted to get in touch. I have some of my books and other information there.
Sweet. Well, I don't know if it'll play out this way, but when my helpers and I look at the next year or two in my ministry, we've been thinking, couldn't we go more in the direction of the mystics and help people with an introduction to them? Maybe we could call upon you to work with us or contribute something along the line.
Certainly be open. I'm a person of faith and a priest really because of the mystics. And so they remain my friends and I continue to study and read and working on a project right now about the English mystics. So absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, there are probably stuff that you can teach about the mystics without skipping a beat. There's probably some of it that's so familiar to you that you'd be able
Yes.
to make it available to people without very much sweat and strain on your part. And
I
uh,
think that's right. And I know you, and I'm looking, I'm sure that's, I think that's true of a lot of us, yourself included, who spent time with the mystics or particular spiritual tradition, but there's definitely need. So
yeah, all right. Well, thanks for being with me. I hope we get to meet in person again. We just were kind of we passed a little bit among hundreds of people at a conference, but I'm grateful that
yes,
we
right.
had the opportunity to get together and make this happen.
And Father Nathan, your ministry is fascinating. And one of the reasons I was at the Science of Consciousness conference is I think the church needs to get outside of her walls, which is a sort of Vatican II theme that hasn't maybe fully been realized. And so you get to talk to all sorts of people who would never normally talk to a Roman Catholic priest.
People might not know of us that the Dominican order, St. Dominic and St. Francis were both founding their orders at about the same time. And they were both, the projects that they undertook were similar in that they were really the earliest to leave the enclosed monastery and create a hybrid model of
Yeah.
of religious life where we're supposed to have the prayer life of a monk, but the open availability to people outside the monastery walls in schools and parishes and now the internet, where whatever. So, and Dominic wanted us to be in the marketplace of ideas. He didn't want to
Yes.
be in some enclosed place where nobody said anything unorthodox. He wanted to make sure that we were out there wherever people were talking about God and spirituality and life itself, and be able to be in the middle of the hurly-burly of all of it. And I'm really
Yeah.
much enjoying that.
Yeah, preach. I mean, as you know, it was scandalous to, people at the time, and I suppose might still be, but he took people who were barely formed, these young men, and said, hey, sending you off to the different university centers, get connected with the
Yes.
debates of the age, and,
And who does that remind you of? You know,
well, yeah, that's right.
Jesus calls up some people away from their fishing nets, and only
Mhm,
a few chapters later is, okay, you've seen me cast out demons, you've seen me heal the sick,
mhm.
you've seen me raise the dead, you go do the same, and I'll meet you back here. That's pretty much what he says.
That's right. It seems like the Christ model, but it still was very scandalous. And of course, Dominicans will often say, um, when you look at Jesus's life, it's sort of like the Dominican life, a life of prayer and retreating to the mountain, and then going out among the people, and then returning, and that's really our Lord's life. So,
Absolutely. Well, what an interesting guy you are. I'm so grateful that you've come on
oh,
and
thanks.
I'm sure we'll get plenty of comment back upon it.
Well, thank you so much. And what's the name of the dog again?
This is Toto, the canine
Toto
family
is
dog.
is very cool, very chill. I mean, a lot of dogs are just. How old is Toto?
He's probably about 11. He's a rescue. Um,
Okay, but I mean, he's very comfortable sitting there, doesn't seem bothered, so
No,
yeah.
very often he'll be good for about 20 minutes on a show like this, and then he'll leave the room.
Oh,
Especially if he
okay.
can hear his master moving about. He's got to have his
Okay.
eyes on him all the time, but he's really worn out. He didn't sleep well, and he had a busy morning, so I think he's more chill than normal. But
Well,
he,
and this was a conversation among hounds, so
That's exactly right. All right. Well, everybody, this is Father Nathan signing off this episode of The Joyful Friar. I hope you enjoyed being with us. You already heard how, if you wanted to be in touch with Father Kevin Goodrich, he's given you that information. We'll have it in the show notes also. If you want to be in touch with me, I'm at nathan-castle.com. I just ask if you're writing about the books the work that I do in the Afterlife Interrupted books. I'd prefer that you would at least read one of them before you ask me a question, because I probably answered it in a book that's already available. But anyway, if you have something that you'd like to talk with me about, just send me an email through the website. For now, this is Father Nathan Castle signing off. And remember that I'm praying for you, whatever it is in your heart of hearts, wherever there's pain or anything unresolved. I'm asking God's grace to be there like an ointment and bring healing to you. So that's for you. Bye now. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Joyful Friar. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. God bless.